Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and with this week's update for Tuesday, not only are we getting some most awaited for PvP nerfs for a variety of classes, but also we're getting a variety of dungeon nerfs with this reset, some raid changes and some small Torghast changes. In this video, we'll be talking about what are some of those changes, and particularly hitting on the dungeon nerfs, particularly if you're someone who hates Plaguefall, Sanguine Depths, or Necrotic Wake, as well as other dungeon nerfs that have happened in order to make these dungeons far easier, to the point where they might actually be nerfed to the ground and actually legitimately puggable, as it does seem like the difficulty of a lot of the M+ dungeons and dungeons in general did go up with this expansion. And while I'm a huge fan of the difficulty, it definitely made it a lot harder for my alts and everybody else that I pug with to get some groups to get them done and timed. So we're going to be taking a look at a bunch of nerfs that have happened in the PvE content today. First of all, let's get into Torghast. This bit of PvE content got a nerf for a variety of mobs. A lot of the mobs inside of Torghast have some powerful spells that they cast, especially when you're doing your twists and corridors trying to get your mount. A lot of those enemies end up scaling really high, and a lot of these casts are actually very deadly. They can put your character at a disadvantage, whether by crack controlling you while a bunch of those mobs beat up on you, or just blasting you with powerful spells, reducing your HP to 0. So if you are a class with other ways to stop a cast, besides just counterspell, kick, pummel, any of those basic interrupts, there's now going to be an opportunity to put all those abilities on cooldown when you interrupt them in any means. That means if you have stuns, or maybe like a gouge, a fear, or a short blind, any one of those CC abilities will now be used as kind of like an interrupt, because it'll make all those abilities that are castable by a lot of the enemies inside of Torghast, now it's going to be put on cooldown if you end up stopping those casts in any way. This is going to make Torghast a lot easier for those players that are having a hard time getting those interrupts, or have a variety of ways to stop casts, like Shadow Priest for example, but your interrupt is like a 45-second cooldown, so you're not going to be able to use it all that regularly. Pretty massive change in terms of making Torghast runs easier, and dealing with a lot of the trash bags gives you now more, if you're a CC based class, a lot more toolkits in order to survive different enemy abilities. We also got some small changes for Castle Nathria, particularly with 2 bosses on Mythic difficulty. There's also other changes to some of the other bosses on Heroic and lower, mostly with the scaling. But if you're particularly doing your Sludge Fist runs, Sludge Fist is now going to have a nerf in health, and some abilities are going to do slightly less damage, which should make this boss a lot easier for a lot of the groups that are trying to push the boss. Then we have a variety of different changes for Stone Legion Generals, second to last boss of Castle Nathria, and this one has got quite a lot of nerfs for it. There's quite a lot of abilities that are getting changed. But the biggest change that have happened to this fight is it was always kind of an inconsistent fight, so Blizzard wanted to make it a lot more consistent in terms of the order at which abilities and different effects that the raid has to deal with occur more regularly, so there's not as sporadic. However, it won't let players immune or avoid certain mechanics completely. Ask anybody that's doing Stone Legion Generals and you'll know that this fight is a bit of a mess. There's a lot of different things, and some aspects of the fight are just kind of broken. So players have to step around Legos in order to be able to somehow do this fight, and it's just an uncomfortable experience through and through. So hopefully these changes make the fight more consistent and in some cases more manageable. Not particularly easier, but more manageable through and through. Now let's dive into some juicy dungeon nerfs, because these are going to be big, particularly if you're someone who has been struggling with some of these dungeons in order to finish them on time, whether you're trying to get your KSM achievement for your mount, or you're simply just trying to get your caps done for the week. First dungeon on the list is going to be Plaguefall. Nothing in Plaguefall is really super difficult, except for the last boss, Margrave Stradama. Margrave is a hard boss whether you're doing her unfortified or tyrannical. She is a tough boss to break through and basically a healer check, and whether you have disease dispels. So Blizzard is going to be tackling it by making the damage and the health of this boss reduced overall by 40%, which is pretty sizable change. We will also reduce the frequency at which she does infectious rain during her final phase, so your group isn't going to melt to the acid rain too quickly. It also slightly adjusted the timing of Plague Crash, so there's a little bit more time in between tentacle slaps, and all of a sudden we have a resounding thank you from Priests as well as Death Knights, the classes with the least amount of mobility that sometimes have a hard time with the Plague Crash tentacles. Then we have Sanguine Depths. There's a variety of different changes, but some of the most important ones are going to be: the first boss is going to have a Severin Smash as well as Essence Absorption, damage reduced by 20%. Severin Smash is the ability where he will smash down into the ground, knocking players back, spawning a Living Essence Orb, and when you touch the orb, that also does AoE damage to the group. This fight always was difficult for healers to figure out the best ways in order to deal with it. Sometimes the damage happens way too quickly, and if you don't have classes that can move out in order to spread these orbs far out so you can soak them one at a time very slowly, it definitely made this fight far harder, especially on Tyrannical when you had to do this a couple times in a row. So this nerf should make this boss far easier. The second boss, Executor Tarvold, his ad that he spawns will have 20% less health, making that portion of the fight that's already pretty claustrophobic far easier. Then we have Spires of Ascension, and a lot of the mobs and bosses in this dungeon are quite difficult. So it's interesting that Blizzard decided to really nerf Laxis, Clotos, and Astronos, which are the mobs that are going to be in your way before the final boss. Those three Kyrian mobs are actually quite tough, whether it is Tyrannical, but especially on Fortified. So Blizzard is doing some things like not make it Sanguine and other certain effects not work with them anymore, and also the oppression debuff that they put up is now halved, which is going to make it that much easier for you to get through them, where you might not even need a lust. And then we're seeing Necrotic Wake absolutely getting butchered left and right. A lot of the mobs are nerfed and there's a lot of changes, but let me tell you about the most important ones from the beginning. The Kyrian armaments from the Javelin, Discarded Shield, Discharge Anima, and Forgotten Forge Hammer, which are some of the tools scattered through the dungeon to make it easier, will now persist through death. This by itself is a massive change and actually has been hotfixed and currently works right now as I'm doing this recording at 2:45, right as we just tried to run that dungeon on a 19. Also, variety of different enemies now just deal lots less damage. Particularly Britain, Bone, Mages, Frostbolt Volley, and Frostbolt, which have a longer cast time and do far less damage. Then you have Nurzada, which is a caster mob that a lot of players choose to skip. He's kind of like before that very first bridge that heads towards this second boss room. That guy is going to do a lot less damage. And the Kyrian Stitchwork mobs around the third boss will also do less melee damage and have far less health, which will make it that much easier for your groups to focus him down, and your tanks won't have to speed kite him all over the place. Blightbone has also gotten nerfed with the worms, as they're a little bit more forgiving, needing 5 stacks of Blood Gorge instead of 3 before they do Carrion Eruption, so be sure to focus down those worms. And Amarth, which is the second boss, a lot of his mobs just do far less damage. Every single one of those adds is now going to spawn closer, so it'll be that much easier for all the melee to pick up the adds and interrupt them, but also they're also going to do a lot less damage, which is going to make that boss, which is generally one of the biggest checks, especially in Tyrannical, far easier. Blizzard really did go in and butcher Necrotic Wake, but probably for a good reason. Out of all the dungeons, I would say that Necrotic Wake is the one dungeon that I'm not super excited when it comes to pugging. And it's the one dungeon I'm always a little bit cautious, even when I'm on my main playing with some of the friends. So this is the one dungeon that I'm really glad that they decided to nerf. Hopefully we'll see a lot more people running this dungeon, and with some of the different changes, hopefully it will be one of the easier dungeons to run for pugs. I always enjoyed the aesthetic of this dungeon. The music is also pretty good. It's one of the 2 Kyrian dungeons with really cool mechanic of all the different armaments, which can make certain boss fights and trash packs far easier. But I wonder if you'll be able to save all of those for bosses, since all the adds are looking like they're gonna do far less damage. Definitely one of the harder dungeons, and I'm really excited about some of those changes. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video. Let me know what you think about some of these PvE changes that have happened in today's update. If you're someone who's going to be doing your Mythic Pluses, if you get Necrotic Wake as a key from your weekly vault, you might actually consider not completely skipping out on that key, as it might actually be doable this week around. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.